ultimately she could not put the nation's interests ahead of her own political ambitions. She just couldn't do it. And she couldn't tell the truth. The government may say, no, the government's lying to you. The press says, we're going to talk about it. Too awkward. The Republicans play hardball. The ET issue is the most inconvenient truth in the world. MUFON is a fascinating story. Someone needs to do a full documentary on MUFON, really. I've interacted with it over the years. I don't belong to it. I don't belong to any organizations. Specifically decided that would be the case from the get-go. The connection between MUFON and the truth embargo, I think, is significant. The first major organization that engaged this issue was NICAP, the National Investigation Committee regarding area phenomena, something in that line, NICAP. Formed early on, and an Air Force officer named Donald Keogh was pretty much its sole director, I believe, for its entire time. And this was in the early days, 50s, when the truth embargo was still in its nascent period. There's a whole lot of moving parts to the truth embargo, and they're just starting to put them together. Right? And so saucers are all over the damn place. They're being seen all over the world. The Roswell event was known to a lot of people, though it slid out of the public perception because of the reversal on the press conference, that the reverse press conference where they denied the story. But there were people in government that knew it was true. Plenty of people that realized this was true. And as a result, NICAP developed a substantial audience, a substantial membership. And the members were filled with engineers and scientists and even intelligence people, including there was members of intelligence, CIA, on the board of NICAP. And the chief science advisor was a gentleman by the name of Dr. James McDonald, who was a very highly qualified atmospheric physicist, who just saw this issue as important and was engaging it in a very scientific way, going all over the country, giving one talk after another to one science and engineering group after another, just basically raising the whole issue and the scientific aspects of it, all very solid, all very the way it ought to be. But, of course, the ET issue was embargoed, and that embargo solidified by the end of the 50s into the 60s, and the government knew that, this has got to be contained, and NICAP is a problem. James McDonald is a problem, because all these scientists and engineers being briefed about this organization doing everything it can, the fact that it has an Air Force officer running it, all of this is just too substantive, and we're trying to ridicule this subject into non-importance. We're trying to work off the Space Brother era of the 50s and just make it irrelevant. And so what they did was, first of all, they took over NICAP by kicking Donald Keogh out. This was the board, which included a number of CIA people. They claimed of financial improprieties. I know he's paying himself something $8,000 a year or something. Then they started shutting down all of the national offices, the outer offices, until it was all just back to the one central office. Paid themselves lavishly. I think there's a book, the book that covers this the best is called Firestorm, which is about the life of Dr. James McDonald. I think they were paying himself $40,000 a year, something like that. And just closed it out. Right. Meanwhile, McDonald was under a lot of pressure and scrutiny and surveillance and harassment. and then he was ridiculed in front of the American people at a. He was tempted into appearing in a House committee one-day event, and where he was ridiculed. He was singled out for ridicule. He went home, and that coupled with the fact that his marriage was coming apart, he ended up killing himself. So Nightcap was closed down, and on the way out the door, I think the last vestiges of it were gone by 72, a new organization sprung up in 1969 called MUFON, essentially to replace NICAP. It's my view, and I can't prove it, but it's important enough to at least put it out there, that MUFON was the government-approved replacement for NICAP. In other words, NICAP is going to go away, but the ET issue isn't going to go away. And the interest in it is obviously growing. Been growing virtually every year since the 50s. They're going to form another group, right? They're going to form another one. They're going to have another group. I don't know. Maybe there'll be an Air Force officer leading that. And so let's back a group that we're going to control. So we can just contain it that way. There's a group, there's things going on, people can join it, go look for saucers and investigate sightings, what have you. But it's not going to get out of hand. And so I think that's what they did. And they controlled it from the board and have forever. But that started to loosen up in the last 10 years. And I think MUFON is probably broken away from any government control in that period. It's had several directors. The current director, Jan Harzan, is very smart, very sharp, and wants a modern and better organization. And that's well and good. But going all the way back to 1997, I have on 4 occasions approached MUFON and basically said, if you want to be an important organization, you cannot simply be a sightings organization and have people join so that they can go look for or investigate sightings. You have got to become a political activist organization like ARP. You've got to make it clear that you are now going to take resources from membership and you're going to confront the government and on the issue of the truth of this matter and lobby the government to bring it out. You give people that motivation, that reason to join, and they will join by the tens of thousands, and MUFON will become an important organization. There's almost no limit to the number of members. Initially, the board said, well, you can't do this, charities can't do that. Well, they were totally wrong. Charities can do it. It's perfectly legal. There's certain restrictions, but they're not severe. And I have very recently made the same statement. If MUFON does not do this, eventually it may become irrelevant. So we'll see. So it's not a liability and it's not an asset so much now as it's a marker, and it do symposiums and it does provide some value without question, but it is done virtually nothing to advance the advocacy process by and large. And we shall see. In general, and this applies to almost everything we've been talking about. Everything that when you're talking about information and organizations and strategies and everything else, everything in the field, I have to look in 2 contexts, 2 baskets: pre-disclosure, post-disclosure. What is the situation on that matter pre-disclosure? What will be the situation post-disclosure? So with respect to MUFON, the situation pre-disclosure is, I think, well understood. What will be its situation post-disclosure? MUFON, of course, has substantial history. It has a few members. It has a few thousand members. It should have 100 times that. But it has this record. And so post-disclosure, it's totally validated as to what it was looking at and what its core mission statement was. Though, again, it has UFO in the middle, and it hasn't been about UFOs for a very long time. So it's hard to get away from that UFO, but that's kind of one way they got away from that is it's MUFON. You don't hear UFO. It's MUFON, all right? Because it's not about UFOs. God, it isn't about UFOs. So will it be relevant or not? My concern is if MUFON doesn't engage the politics of this and start building its membership now, as soon as possible. Post-disclosure, the interest and intensity about the subject will just go off the charts, and there will be people with huge amounts of money, other organizations, corporations with huge amounts of money, and they can form an organization just like that. The Post-Disclosure, whatever, Extraterrestrial Phenomena Engagement Association. Put $100 million in it, and off it goes. And MUFON is just sitting over there and just evaporates into the mist. An anachronistic carryover of an earlier time, which would be kind of sad. I'd like to see MUFON have a life pro-disclosure. But I fear that if they don't make their move to build their membership and go political, that will not happen. But on the other hand, post-disclosure, there may be some people that out there that go, wow, you guys have carried this water for so long, and you put in the effort. Here's $50 million. Now, go get 10 million members and let's start influencing. You carrying your history forward, influencing the post-disclosure policies. The post-disclosure world is where all the fun is. That's where all this is going. Disclosure is nothing more than a simple announcement. That's it. There's extraterrestrials here. Then what? Then what? Reshaping the entire world, reforming government institutions, adapting to it in a completely different paradigm. That's what's going to be fun, but incredibly hard work. But fortunately, there'll be tens upon hundreds of millions of people ready to sign up. That's what I've been aiming for. My dreaded fear is I'll not live long enough in it to even have an influence. I've had a lot of colleagues die in the last few years, most of them irritatingly are younger than I am. So, but that's where we have to, that's what this is all about. It's getting to the post-disclosure world. It's getting access to the technologies they have sequestered, propulsion, maybe advanced energy systems, applying those to human problems. And then ultimately maybe creating through a learning curve, a huge learning curve, global learning curve, which the internet will facilitate wonderfully, allowing for the basis for open contact, which I think is inevitable and probably following it. Open contact's a whole nother paradigm again. All of this could be in our future. But right now, you know what's in our future? You know the one thing that I am most concerned about that could easily happen before a disclosure event takes place? Nuclear terrorist attack. It is the #1 concern of everybody in Washington when they've had 4 drinks. Okay? You go to a cocktail party, get 4 drinks. What do you worry about? I'm worried about the nuke attack. Nuke attack where? Washington, D.C. Really? Yeah. Why isn't that the Washington Post? Oh, they're not going to. We don't talk about that. That just upsets people. Plus, all of us own real estate, you know, in the metro area. The last thing we want is people thinking that we're a target for a nuclear attack. Are we a target for a nuclear attack? We're the #1 target for a nuclear attack. Why is Washington, D.C. the #1 target for a nuclear terrorist attack? Because we're bombing people all over the world. We've killed millions. We dropped more bombs in Vietnam than the entire World War II. We've dropped over 500,000 bombs in the Middle East since the first Iraq War. We've killed thousands, women, children. We've blown up schools, hospitals, electrical plants, water facilities. We've created chaos. We've helped produce the rise of terrorist organizations unprecedented since the Nazi early assassination teams. We've helped create a suicide army that dwarfs the kamikaze groups that were the biggest threat and the scariest thing that ever happened to the U.S. military in World War II. So, yeah, there's so many groups out there, so many people out there, if they had their hands on a nuclear weapon, they would drive to downtown Washington without even thinking twice, and they would sit in the car when it went off. And this is what's heading us like a freight train. And I've talked about it. I've talked about it in Canada, and I'll continue to talk about it. Your government will never talk about this because it would upset you, and reduce real estate values. The media won't talk about it because the government's not going to give them any information, and they don't want to accept you either. The real stuff that you need to be worried about, you're not going to hear about. The stuff you probably shouldn't care about, you're going to be marinated in it. And then between those two, you're going to have so many lies thrown at you that you'll lose the ability to determine the truth almost permanently. That's what's heading for us. And so when people say, why should disclosure happen soon? Why should I fund it? Because, it'll all happen eventually. Not if the nuclear terrorist attack happens. Why is that? Because I'm not talking about nuclear war. Let's talk about nuclear terrorist attack. Somebody, supposedly some middle-class Saudi Arabians, decided it would be really neat to fly some airplanes into U.S. buildings, which they did. They weren't holograms. I'm so sorry to disappoint. And they killed 3,000 Americans, patriotic Americans at the Pentagon. Unfortunately for us, maybe not for them, the wrong president happened to be in the White House at the time. And so what was the response to the loss of those two buildings, a hole in the Pentagon, and 3,300 some people? The biggest mistake in the history of the United States, a $4 to $6 trillion multi-war campaign, setting the entire Middle East on fire, creating chaos, launching the largest migration diaspora since World War II, threatening the entire European Union. That's all that came from that. Not to mention the death of 1 million people, minimum. So what do you think will be the response of the United States if a simple MIRV weapon, which you can put in the back of a Volkswagen, or any number of other nuclear tactical shells, which if you think they have them fully accounted for, you're living in dreamland. What do you think happens if one of those goes off on the mall and kills the President of the United States and the entire Congress in a single 15 seconds? What will be the U.S. response to that? And what do you think the world will be like then? And that doesn't assume we don't generate a nuclear war simply by brinksmanship, which is going on now everywhere. That's the reason why disclosure needs to happen, so that we can go into another place, another paradigm shift to another place where we can rethink everything. Do we want to continue to do this? Do we want to continue to act this way? Is bombing people the fundamental first choice for diplomacy and politics? Right? Is killing people just in order to keep a permanent war economy going so that certain corporations and others can be well appointed? Is that what we want to continue? Or would you like to see the world aware of an extraterrestrial presence, eyes to the sky, and maybe even on the verge of open contact with other civilizations who apparently do not conduct their affairs that way? That's what the funding is needed for. And is it harder to get this across to even smart people than, oh God, please let me save some whales from the Japanese whaling fleet? Yeah, by a factor of maybe 100. But, that's the way it is, right? I had high hopes that President Obama would be the disclosure president. And the reason was that obviously the Clintons weren't able to disclose. They hit the wall. The constitutional breach blocked them. I'm sure that they were irritated by that. And by the way, they were also attacked. I mean, once Rockefeller showed up in the White House, and once the Rockefeller Initiative started, alarm bells were going all over the military intelligence complex. Oh my God, this Bubba, this pot-smoking, womanizing, lying Bubba from Arkansas is dealing with the ET issue. My God. And so, not surprisingly, everything started being heaped on him. Every scandal. They attacked everything. Her, him, the kids, the dogs, the cats, the relatives, every scandal you could imagine, they're fishing it up. The right wing went nuts, but I think the right wing might have been getting some help from the military intelligence complex, some dossiers, whatever. They just kept them constantly under fire. So nothing happened there, but they must have irritated him to no end. And so, okay, fine. If Gore becomes president, Gore had such a tight connection to the Clintons, and the Clintons would have been involved in, of course, the release of the information and what have you, and it had been kind of a Clinton-Gore combo. Would have been so bad, but he lost. You got 8 years to go by. And, Hillary Clinton's not getting any younger. And then up comes Obama. And so the next best thing for a Clinton to be the disclosure president is for the Democratic Party to be the disclosure party. And so, how long can this truth embargo hold out? Obama could be the disclosure president. Okay, fine, sounds good as a theory, but where's the evidence that that kind of thinking was in play? Well, let me tell you, the evidence turned up pretty quickly. Remember, Podesta calls for the release of UFO files 2002, 2003, 2005, and again in 2010. So now, Obama comes up, takes the election away from Secretary Clinton, who, if she had won in 2008, I think would have disclosed. And so I'm looking for any indications of this connection between Obama and the Clintons on the ET issue. What happens? Who does President Obama, elect Obama, pick as his chairman of his transition team to form the new government? John Podesta. White House, Chief of Staff to President, and key advisor during the entire Rockefeller Initiative, who'd called for the UFO files to be released several times. Apparently, that didn't bother Obama. He's the transition chair. Okay, fine. And who do they pick to be in the government? He and John Podesta. Well, naturally, Hillary Clinton is going to become Secretary of State. Rockefeller Initiative. Leon Panetta, CIA Director. Rockefeller Initiative. All right. Secretary of Commerce, Bill Richardson. Rockefeller Initiative. Whoa. It was so obvious. They're literally building the platform, right? They're all there. So they all party together. Obama could do it. But the Republicans play hardball. For those of you that are not familiar with U.S. politics, here's how it works. The Republicans play hardball, and the Democrats, progressives, play wiffle ball. And so when the Democrats are upset with Republicans for something they want to do or some program they want to initiate, they beat them around the head and shoulders with little wiffle ball bats, saying, we don't want you to do that. Maybe they'll march a little bit with candles in their hands or whatever. When the Republicans don't want the Democrats to succeed or want to block them from taking some course of action, they beat them to death with baseball bats and leave them in the middle of the street to be run over by semi-tractor trailers. That's why there's kind of an asymmetry here about how things go in the United States. So when Bush comes in 2001, the first thing he does is launch a major tax cut for the rich that virtually drains the treasury and all the surplus that Clinton had been built up, so the Democrats had no money to do anything with. Of course, it screwed off a lot of poor people, but whatever. That's hardball. So now you've got Obama coming in. And first of all, he's the wrong color. That's irritating for them. And then he's very progressive. He even hangs out with communists, apparently, back in Chicago, they believe. And he's got this mandate. I mean, people were just fired up. Or they knew it was coming. Let me put it this way. They knew what was coming. By August, they knew it was coming. Massive mandate, first black president, and so forth and so forth. And they also knew about the Republican hierarchy, the top-end people, the intelligentsia know about the ET presidents. They just don't want to rock that boat, but they know about it. And they know that the Clintons have this connection to it, and they know that Podesta is going to be the campaign involvement. They know they're going to bring the Rockefeller Initiative connected people into the administration. And so they're looking at, wow, a first black president, disclosure president, paradigm shifter, Hillary Clinton getting a whole bunch of the glory, the Democrats be lauded for 1,000 years. My God, that can't happen. We'll never get back in the White House. We'll become irrelevant. Let's get out the baseball bats. And what did they do? Well, the Republican leadership was fully aware that Wall Street had been pumping the whole economy up like a balloon and raking billions of dollars into their pockets and generally creating one of the biggest bubble in history. They knew all about that. But they had a problem. That bubble was getting ready to burst. And if it were to burst, say, under a new Democratic president, a whole lot of Wall Street guys are going to go to jail. And that would empower the Democrats. So what do you do when you have a situation like that? It's very simple. You arrange for some of the Wall Street firms to get into trouble right away. In other words, you announce it. Hey, we're in deep trouble. Morgan Stanley gets bailed out, but then Lehman Brothers has to fall. And when does this take place? It takes place even before the election in October. Lehman Brothers has collapsed. Absolute worst crisis is clearly headed for us. All hell is about to break loose. We need billions of dollars in funding. We need hundreds of billions of dollars of funding. We need a massive bailout to save the economy. And guess what? Oh, by the way, they knew by August. I mean, they knew hell in July that McCain wasn't going to win the election. So they knew what they were facing. They knew he was going to win in November. And so they get that bailout rolling under George Bush. And then, of course, even though Obama wins in November of 2008, there's a 77-some-day transition period where Bush is still president. And so that's all that time. They're just ratcheting the whole damn thing up. And by the time Obama walks into the White House, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in TARP money is in the pipeline, all going to the banks and the investment bankers and the Wall Street hedge fund guys who then paid off all of their debts and their foreign debts and then gave themselves massive bonuses while the middle class and the lower class was about to be slaughtered. And so Obama walks into a White House in the middle of the worst financial crisis since the Depression. There's no money at all in the government. The national debt is exploding, and the whole process of bailing out the Wall Street Republican empire is already fully underway. And so his ability to do anything, accomplish anything, was gone. And that includes announcing the extraterrestrial presence. And ultimately they succeeded. History will view his presidency as a failed presidency, but not because the man didn't want to do more, but because the politics of that era, which really came to, I think, full fruition with the Obama presidency, is the worst, nastiest, ugliest, most vile, most propaganda-ridden in all of modern time. And it is bad that if it continues it that way, the republic will fall. So, no, Obama could not be the disclosure president. But Hillary Clinton decided to give it another shot. And I think she was more than prepared to do it. And the Republicans couldn't stop her. I don't think there's anything the Republicans have done to prevent it. And PRG did everything it could to set the stage, and we set the stage. Oh my God! If you go to ParadigmResearchGroup.org, and there's a link to the left, which is the Clinton ET connection coverage. Go read some of the hundreds of articles that were written about this connection. Read some of the 130 articles in mainstream press about PRG's efforts, with links to the documents and so forth. And then look at the videos and the statements made by the campaign, by Clinton's campaign during that period. They're all right there. The whole thing is there. It's a huge, massive page. And then you might get a sense of just how much went down there and how close we were. She could never escape from the ET issue again. She's going to be president, and the reporters are going to be in front of her. And all she has to do is open her mouth and say some truths, and she's the disclosure president. She goes down in history. They would have built a monument to her on the Mall in Washington. Yeah, she would have been the disclosure president, but she lost. And a lot of reasons why she lost. But and any one of 10 things, if you pull it out of the equation, she probably still wins because it was that close. But ultimately, the loss comes down to her. Ultimately, she could not put the nation's interests ahead of her own political ambitions. She just couldn't do it. And she couldn't tell the truth. It just wasn't there. Too often she was going to bend it or avoid it. She made a colossal mistake in refusing to divulge her Goldman Sachs speeches, the full content, at the same time demanding that, Trump put as tax returns. It was just an awful, awful campaign. And I contacted Podesta several times pointing out, you got to change course. And the ET issue is your way out. No response. And now it's over. And so we'll see what happens next. The constitutional breach is something I'm talking more and more about. I really should have been speaking with some clarity on this a lot sooner. Because people are constantly asking why the government hasn't disclosed. Why wouldn't they tell us? What's the problem? On and on and on. Why can't the president do it? Etc. The reason is that is the barrier that one has to climb over to get disclosure. And what is it? Essentially, I describe the history of it this way. It starts around 1962-3. President Truman and President Eisenhower were fully briefed on the extraterrestrial issue, and of course pretty much briefed on the entire workings of the growing intelligence world, which included the new NSA and the converted from the OSS CIA and so forth and so forth. They kind of knew what was going on. I don't think there was very little kept from them at all. But that empire was growing, and by 1960, it was large. And Eisenhower would have known that the ET issue was a major component of building the secret empire. Al Gore is an interesting story. First of all, Al Gore was in the White House during the Rockefeller Initiative. He was President Clinton's vice president. And they were very close. It was well known. They were very close, very tight, got along well. Al Gore knew there was an extraterrestrial issue in being engaged by Rockefeller in the OSTP. Absolutely knew about it. And, of course, he never spoke about it either because we know he had political ambitions. And so he ran for president. Of course, never spoke to the ET issue. And lost to George W. Bush. Interestingly enough, that election was lost in November of 2000, and then Bush took over the White House in January of 2001. And it was really only about another 19 months when Podesta in 2002 called for the release of all the UFO files, which is like a hook back to the Clinton situation, the Rockefeller Initiative. He's putting a breadcrumb down to kind of connect back to it when the time is right, without mentioning it, of course. So Al loses, and then he goes on to become famous for his next great contribution, simply, obviously, his work on global warming, which he's going around and talking about at great length. And then they create the documentary, which was good, Inconvenient Truth. Now, the global warming issue is extremely controversial. Not so much for the science, though the science is complicated, but because it's been fully politicized. How you address global warming, depending upon how you address it, has huge implications for certain industries and business, without question. And the Republican Party, by and large, is the party of business. It's the party of capitalism. It's the party of Wall Street. And so they're very, very sensitive to anything that could take the money out of the pockets of anybody that they represent, support, or funds them. And so they've pushed back against the global warming science. But it's political. It's not science. The principal controversy in it is, and the, I guess you say the Democratic side of this science, it should be faulted for, is that almost certainly human activity is not the sole, by any means, the sole basis for this warming trend. There is other factors involved of a much more macroscopic level. And it's even not clear what percentage is human caused. For instance, if it was only a small percentage and the rest is being generated by things happening in the solar system, moving those numbers around or dealing with emissions or what have you may be irrelevant. Who knows? It's not clear. But the idea that the global warming is not taking place is, of course, ridiculous. But then politics has been generating the ridiculous now in mass quantities, ever greater mass quantities all the time. The fact is that the Earth has gone through numerous cycles of hot and cold forever. And there have been ice ages, and there have been extremely wet periods. A lot of people don't know that the Mediterranean Sea is like drained several times down to nothing and then refilled again. That's a big deal. That's why there's these massive salt deposits. So what's the point here? The point here is this. Whether or not humans are adding too much to the global warming process is less important to the fact that civilization is now arrived. Showers, flush toilets, cars, giant buildings, all that stuff, plus 7 billion people. 7+ billion people. And we cannot afford the luxury of another ice age or another super wet period. We can't afford it. Right? It's totally natural. But, you know, we weren't around back then. And whatever animals were around back then, what the hell? And believe me, there have been huge die-offs because of these cycles. Where 50, 60, 80, 90% of all living species gone. Obviously, that's not a good thing if you're a civilization. So what are we going to do about that? Well, that's the first point I want to make about Al Gore. The second point is that, and I put an open letter to him. It's been out for a while. I haven't repeated it in a while, but I put it out there. And this is kind of interesting. First of all, one, he was connected to the extraterrestrial issue when he was in the White House and aware of the Rockefeller Initiative, which he's never spoken about. Two, he becomes a global figure and becomes important on his own based upon the movie Inconvenient Truth. The ET issue is the most inconvenient truth in the world. On the inconvenient scale, it's way above the global warming truth. And the government has gone to massive lengths to keep it inconvenient and out of the public domain. Whereas with respect to global warming, the government was like, yeah, you know, actually probably been pushing, if anything. And so if you want to do an inconvenient truth movie, or if you want to get into an inconvenient, that's the one to get into. And that's what I would say to Al Gore if I ever had 5 minutes with him, which is not likely to happen either. So here is an example, a wonderful example of somebody who wants to make a difference, is an activist, has resources, took on an issue, took heaps and heaps of ridicule, criticism, all kinds of parodies, big joke, because he tweaked political policy area that people had vested interest in. But he hasn't got the courage to take on the ET issue. That's too much for him. That gives you an idea of just what we're up against. But maybe Al Gore will change his mind on that and consider the possibility that global warming pretty much been sussed out, kind of know what's going on there. Those that are convinced it's not true will never change their mind, and those that are certain that it is true are going to do what they can. Maybe it's time for another issue of even bigger importance. The children of today, assuming things don't go really bad, will, of course, live in the post-disclosure world. And it's going to be pretty cool. I envy them. So parents might, if they have enough information, might want to talk about that, what it might be like in the post-disclosure world. What it might be like in a world where everybody now knows that we're not alone in the universe. and what it might be like in a post-contact world where ETs are in formal contact. We already have contact, understand, but it's not formal. You know, they're not having, maybe at least on Skype or something, discussions with our government about potential policies. Now they're taking your brother-in-law out of his bedroom in the middle of the night for checkups. That's not the same. That's not open contact. They could talk about that. But in terms of the pre-disclosure world, the circumstance we're in now, it's the children they're not a factor. The millennials, particularly the ones in the 20s, they're not connected to this issue yet, and I don't know if they will. There's a whole lot of things for them to do. They're completely technologically wired, and there's so lot to do. And maybe in certain not developed countries or less developed countries, but they don't have the information base. The millennials here just got too many things to do. So, and they've lived under the truth embargo from the beginning, and they may not even think it's all that important. It's up to the baby boomer generation, my generation, and the Gen X. Right, people up into their 70s. And people up into their 40s, late 40s, to deal with this and deal with it now. Because if we do not change course, the millennials are not going to grow old. And the children of today are not even going to make it to college. The real threats that we're facing as a planet and a species are not discussed openly because we're not allowed to, or simply refuse to have discussions about those things, right? The trivial, all day long, right? The convenient, all day long. But the real stuff that really matters, don't want to upset anybody. Don't upset, cause a problem. So, but nobody has universal control over everything. Nobody, it's not all wrapped up tight. There are hints, there are moments, there are things that come out that if you pay attention, you kind of can see the picture, connect the dots. These are called limited hangouts. Basically, this is people that are saying, okay, we're going to put that out, so, we did something, and if anybody questions us later, well, we did this. Limited hangouts. They don't want to totally hang out. Nobody wants to totally hang out. Certainly not politicians. We are not out of the woods by a long shot, and things are decaying. And so we have a limited amount of time to get disclosure done, to open up the world to the reality of this profound truth that we're not alone in the universe, and we're already being engaged by other civilizations. Because if the nuclear events occur and all that follows, it's moot. It really won't matter. And so if you care about your children's future, you should really think hard about whether you want to support this effort to once and for all end this perfidious lie that we are alone in the universe and there's no evidence for an extraterrestrial presence. It had a certain value during the Cold War. That value was gone. The government's not going to tell you these truths. The politicians are not going to tell you these truths. And the media doesn't quite have the courage to tell you these truths. That's the future if we don't have a systemic, broad-based spectrum institutional reform. And anyone that's looking at British politics, or the United States politics, or even China and Russia, broad spectrum institutional reform is not on the horizon. And the standard policies of war as politics and diplomacy by other means still fully in force. And so we are, as I've said many times, in a race between two clocks. One of which Paradigm Research Group created in 1998, I think it was. And the other was created by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in 1947. One clock is famous, and the other is not so famous. The paradigm clock was created by Paradigm Research Group. It was retroactively published in 1947, meaning I set it up, but I pretended like it started in 1947 at exactly the same time as the other clock. And then I showed how it's been affected over those years by events and what have you. And then it got neglected, and it's kind of boxed in. It's set at a time that's not appropriate, and I need to revitalize it. The paradigm clock. The other clock, which was definitely created in 1947, is called the Doomsday Clock. And it was created by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which is a bulletin for lots of atomic scientists. And the Doomsday Clock was their effort to engage the threat of nuclear war. So midnight on that clock was nuclear war, and they set the clock initially at 7 minutes to midnight. And then over the years, they moved it either closer or further away from midnight, depending upon the threat of nuclear war, which is endgame. All right? And they've gone to great lengths. They have a panel, and they always make an announcement, and it always gets press. Notably, in the last 12 months, they've moved it closer to midnight twice. 1 minute and 30 seconds. Now it's 2 minutes and 30 seconds from midnight. Doomsday Clock. The paradigm clock has a different midnight. The paradigm clock's midnight is disclosure, the formal acknowledgement by heads of state of nations of an extraterrestrial presence engaging the human race, the beginning of the post-disclosure world, which opens up doors and possibilities for reform, changing course, whatever. Doesn't guarantee anything, but it's a pretty good gambit. These two clocks have been racing each other since 1947 in a way. Which one strikes midnight first? The processes leading to nuclear war and midnight on the Doomsday Clock are being funded by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars every single year. The United States spends $600 billion on its military and defense and classified programs and war costs. Our terrible enemy, the newly demonized Russia, spends
$90 billion.
600 billion.
$90 billion.
Okay. China spends
$200 billion.
The effort to get the paradigm clock to midnight is funded with nickels and dimes, pennies. Nothing, barely, of consequence. But, you know, everyone counts, and all of those that have supported PRG, for instance, you're all heroes. And most of the people that supported didn't have much to begin with, really. And usually it's that way. The ones that have a lot, can't touch it. The ones that have very little, I do what I can. Nickels and dimes. Hundreds of billions of dollars. So one would say, this clock's going to hit midnight first? What is an activist to do? The thing about activism is that activism, unlike government, doesn't have quite the restraints on it. Government has a lot of restraints, a lot of structure, and rules and laws and everything else. They kind of, you know, they can do terrible things, but they just can't go totally nuts. Activists basically is a totally open situation. You can climb in any little window, you can come in through the chimney, you can stand on your head and sing the national anthem. There's all kinds of things you can do. And it's possible to find that little crack in the door and get through, or come up with a strategy that they don't see coming. There's things activists do, and how they often succeed. Activists are able to overcome unbelievable financial asymmetry and force massive power to change course. So that's what the truth advocacy movement for disclosure is about. And that's the way we're having to operate. But a little more funding could be very, very helpful in this race between which clock strikes midnight and what the future of the human race really is going to be about. Now we're done.